What is South Africa really like? We've heard a lot about it in the news in the last few months, with some 50 South African farmers coming to the United States and various chants of violence. But what is it really like? What is the history? What's the Christian influence there? I'm joined by a very special guest today to talk about that from an inside point of view, and we'll be talking about that today on Theology on Air. Thanks for listening to Theology on Air, an outgrowth of Theology by the Pint. So right away, I want to make sure you go to theologybythepint.org to learn more about our past events, upcoming events, how you can support us financially. But we definitely do want you to show up to our events coming up, including a fundraiser in September for our 10th anniversary. So theologybythepint.org is where to go to learn about all of that. And for my YouTube watchers, I want to apologize in advance. There's some filter on this camera that I do not understand. So I need someone that understands tech to become a producer for the show, because I've reached I'm like a Peter principle. I don't know anymore, and I never will learn anymore. So all that said, thank you for listening and watching. Do subscribe. It does help us out, so that you get notified of all these things. So without further delay, I want to introduce my friend, fellow pastor in the North American Lutheran Church, LeMae Higgs.
Yes.
And she has a past life as a counselor, although psychiatrist.
Clinical psychologist.
Clinical psychologist, all right.
Yes.
I know there's a bit of a difference there. And so you ended up at a time in South Africa. You and I were at a retreat a few months back, and I just started asking questions about South Africa, and I thought it was really interesting. And so, even though you are now the pastor at Swiss Alp,
Yeah, United Evangelical Lutheran Church
Okay.
at Swiss Alp.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting story there, Texas history story about why it's called Swiss Alp and such. But
Yes, yeah.
But you can look her up there if you find yourself somewhere in between Houston and the Hill Country. Kind of near Schulenburg,
Yep.
right?
Right north of Schulenburg, yeah.
Go see the historic United Lutheran Church there at Swiss Alp, and LeMae's the pastor there. So,
Yeah.
but all that said, you've been there for a number of years, and you happen to be in town in Houston. So I said, come by the studio. I want to record that conversation about South Africa. So maybe give us a little bit of background. Tell us how you ended up in South Africa.
Well, it's interesting because we were living in Sweden. I'm a small town Texas girl that has had some amazing opportunities come my way. And living in Sweden, it was quite cold, and I wanted to go someplace warm. And I asked my mother, and I was thinking Mallorca or, southern France or something. And she said, let's go to South Africa. And this was back in the late 70s, 1970s. And even back then I said, oh no, it's too dangerous. There's terrorists, and I'm not sure I want to go. But my mother was more adventurous than I was. And she said, no, I've checked into it and we really should go. So I took my vacation that year from Sweden, and we went on a tour of South Africa. And after that, I understand the love and the lure of Africa. It is amazing. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I brought some picture books here for Evan to look at today. Also, so South Africa is about the size of Texas, almost identically, and just as we have many different ecological regions in Texas, there are many ecological regions in South Africa. The beautiful Cape Town coastline, up the coastline to Durban, the Garden Route, and then you come in the middle of the country and you're up on what is called the High Veld. It's over a mile high, and the weather never gets over 80 and barely ever gets to freezing. It's really an ideal sort of climate. And then you go to the Low Veld. If you ever get the chance, go check out a movie called Gods Must Be Crazy.
Oh, yes. Part of my childhood.
And that shows the escarpment where the high veld falls off into the low veld. So you're going from mile high down to essentially the coast.
Wow.
And a beautiful tropical area there. Oranges, avocados, all kinds of things grown. So you have these amazing different ecological systems and areas. I was looking for just a few facts here that apparently the population today is 63 million. At the time I was there in the 70s, and I'm sorry, in the 80s into the early 90s, it was about 15 million, which was about the population of Texas and about that size. So anyway, after seeing the place, I took my then husband back for a vacation. They made him a job offer we couldn't refuse. He was a specialist architect doing
Hmm.
energy efficient housing for low income projects. And so we went back, and at that point, I also registered to be a clinical psychologist. I had to redo an internship of a year. And after that, I was number 256 clinical psychologist in the country of 15 million. I've never worked harder in my life.
I imagine. Yeah.
It was, the needs were great, and everybody sometimes asks, were you a missionary? And I said, an inadvertent one, because I have never worked with such dedicated Christians, just wonderful people. I wound up teaching at Medunsa, the Black Medical University, teaching master's students in psychology, running the oncology and the renal dialysis units there. I worked at a halfway house. I had the embassy grant for mental health. That was my real money. And a lot of the others I was able to do more charitable kind of work.
Yeah, sure. What? How long were you there?
Well, we went thinking we would go for 3 years and wound up staying 11.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We sort of fell in love with it and just fell into the rhythm of the place. We went in 1981 in December. My daughter was 6 weeks old. She'd been born in Sweden. And I really remember going in through customs, holding my infant in my arms. And the Afrikaner customs agent looked at me and he said, "You will never understand this country. She, growing up here, will, but you won't." And
he sounds like Simeon in the temple, some prophetic word as you're,
prophetic word. And I just, at the time, I thought, well, really, he's rather full of himself, isn't he? Or whatever. But the longer I lived there, the more I realized how absolutely right he was. Their tourism slogan back in the days was called "A World in One Country," and I think that's a very apt slogan. Also, in my little notes here, AI chat is wonderful. There are 11 official languages spoken.
That was going to be one of my questions.
Africa.
What? I assume if you're an English speaker, you could probably get around, and we'll talk about colonialism here in a minute. But
there's much more Afrikaans spoken. English is the official language, or one of the 11 actually official languages.
And Afrikaners is.
And Afrikaans is old Low Dutch.
Okay.
So kind of in order to begin to understand the country, you have to go way back. The country was essentially unoccupied for several centuries, really. The Phoenicians landed along the coast. So this is Greece, ancient Greece and Rome. The Phoenicians landed, brought sheep and genetics, and left behind a group of what were called colorids along the coast that were mixed race, Phoenician and African, along with the sheep and other things that came there. And then in 1652, the Dutch came, and that were the Afrikaners, the later Afrikaners. The Dutch came and colonized the Cape in 1652, and then almost immediately in 1688, a large group of French Huguenots arrived in the Cape, fleeing Catholic persecution. Those two groups intermarried, and although French was then dropped as a language, you see a lot of French surnames among the Afrikaners, Duplessis and Marais and things. So the names are still there, but they are mostly Dutch Reformed Church. And
so like Calvinist in their Christian.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And they.
Well, let me just.
Okay,
I mean, this is probably pretty obvious, but. South Africa, it was a place to stop on a ship route. I don't know if
Yes.
the prevailing winds go there, but just in terms of, restocking and such. So Cape Town is a place where you would stop and,
Very famous harbor,
okay.
and you could get a lot of fruits and vegetables right outside of town. When the Huguenots arrived, they brought winemaking from France, and so there's big vineyards and orchard areas. If you compare the bottom of South America versus the bottom of Africa, that harbor is so much quieter and safe. Although it's very stormy. At one time, it was called the Cape of Storms before it's called the Cape of Good Hope. So yes, it was a stopping way station and refurbish your ships, that
Gotcha.
sort of thing,
So
for a long time.
It has kind of good reason to exist, commercially.
Yes.
And and so the Dutch were, good seafarers, and later the English show up. We'll get to that later, but because they obviously were colonizers as well. And so colonialism, or the kind of concept of colonizing, is at the heart of a lot of this conversation. But would you say that how long were the Dutch there, and I guess the French, and they were living, they were sort of settling?
Yes, very interesting. For around 200 years before the British show up, so it's a very settled.
And so, were there native African people there, South African people there?
Very few. Interesting. Like I said, you had the colored populations along the coast, and then in the interior, you have the Bushmen, who are hunter-gatherer associations, and I think they're called the Khoi, I want to say now, but we call them Bushmen then, but there's another name.
Is Bushman like a racist term now? Is it one of those things where we don't say that anymore?
It's a Khoisan is the current, and they're very, if you see the Gods Must Be Crazy, that is a Bushman family that's pictured there. Their language is a lovely language of clicks and bird song whistles, and very interesting. And genetically, they're just amazing. They use poison darts to hunt animals. They can run that animal will take 2 or 3 days to die, and they run it down until it dies from the poison dart. And then they immediately pack up the best of the food to take back to their children, who, they need to keep alive. But they themselves sit at the kill and eat like 40 to 50 pounds of meat, and they're genetically adapted where they put on that much weight.
Oh my goodness.
It just stores in their body, and then they will run that 2 to 3 days back to their native village to feed their children. It's just a wonderful, interesting culture.
The Gods Must Be Crazy. I think you can watch it on a free streaming services, because I actually wanted my kids to watch it. But basically, the story is there's a white guy flying in like a single prop plane over this tribe in South Africa, and he drops a Coke bottle out the window, and that's an invention they've never seen, so it kind of wreaks havoc on the, because the kids start to fight over it. So where they had peace, now they have no peace. They use it to mash roots and to make musical sounds, and it's the gods dropped this Coke bottle, and they must be crazy because they did this terrible thing. So then it's the story of the leader of the tribe going to the end of the earth, which is what you just mentioned, and where there's this huge drop off to throw this terrible invention into the abyss,
back into the gods.
And so it's quite funny, and there's a lot of hijinks along the way. Okay, so at some point, there is, I guess you would say, a conflict where there are tribes from sort of inland Africa that work their way down.
Yes.
Is that right? So when does that sort of happen, and what is the result of that?
Yeah, the Bantu people have been slowly kind of working their way down, but the Zulu are one of the Bantu tribes, and they arose as a very warlike tribe. And they wound up pushing a lot of tribes in front of them as they conquered them, and actually pushing them into South Africa, where they hadn't been before. And some of these wind up going up into the mountains to escape the Zulu. That's why you have Lesotho and Swaziland, mountain kingdoms, which sometimes, happens when you're trying to find a safe place and you've got a pretty difficult enemy. And then I'm not an anthropologist, so I think there's kind of mixed understandings, but a very famous king, Shaka Zulu, arose in the late 1800s, if I have my dates right here, and he really formed the Zulu people into a strong group, which became even more warlike. And as they are sweeping south, they wind up confronting the Afrikaners who are fortrekking north in order to escape the British, who have now landed in Cape Town and want to begin to take over the country. So we're talking about the late 1800s. I'm sorry, we're talking about the very early 1800s. The British take permanent control of the Cape Colony in 1806, and then by 1838, the Voortrekkers are moving in the middle of the country, and they clash with the Zulus. There's also a lovely movie, if you want to see Zulu, which is quite historically, I think, accurate, about a famous battle at Blood River. And there were 30,000 Zulus and 464 Afrikaans. And around 3,000 of the Zulu wound up being killed, with only 3 of the Afrikaners wounded. And then that allowed...
Sounds like a technological difference.
There's no doubt. I mean, the Afrikaners have great respect for the Zulu warriors, and vice versa, I think. They did try to make peace. I think it's interesting, because I was doing a little research, prior to talking to you today. And Pete Retief is famous because in February 6 of 1838, he and about 100 other Voortrekkers had gone to negotiate a peace treaty with the current King Dingaan, who was the leading of the Zulus. And he and 100 Voortrekkers wound up being massacred when they went to try to sign this peace treaty. He was a strong Christian and thought, yeah, we will do this by treaty. We don't want to have arguments. We'll try to see what we can work out. Well, that was in February of 1838. And then by December of that year, you have this major battle between the Zulus and the Afrikaners, in which the Afrikaners won, and then they were able to settle and
So really, I mean, you could say that the Afrikaners were actually sort of there first. Not that necessarily gives one exclusive right to land.
No,
that's a more complicated question.
It's a more complicated question.
Hey guys, Sarah Stone here. Sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a riveting podcast episode, but Theology by the Pint needs your help to continue providing these podcasts, offering our in-person events, and growing so we can bring thoughtful conversation and the hope of the gospel to a world that's increasingly walking away from church and from faith. Now that we're a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations are tax deductible, so we've crunched the numbers, and if each listener of this episode gave just $1 for each episode you listen to, we'd put a huge dent in our annual budget. So consider giving today. Go to theologybythepint.org/give and click the link to donate. Thanks so much, and now back to our show.
But certainly, if you look that they had been there since 1652, and when they were settling and getting a large population on the coast, a good number of these tribes were still very much up in the middle of Africa. And so it was just kind of this...
And they obviously did a lot of development.
Yeah.
To make it a commercial... I'm sorry,
commercial, yeah. Vineyards and, planting crops and other things. And we're very settled along the Cape. But as I said, wanting religious freedom and political freedom, which is what they had escaped in 1652, and the Huguenots also, who now are genetically completely mixed with them, they were like, no, we don't want to go back to being under the, some sort of church and state like the English have. We want our independence like we've always had. So rather than fight at that time, they said, let's just trek into the interior. So this is called the Great Trek. Go into the interior, resettle new lands. The British won't bother us then. They want the Cape.
The Brits and the Afrikaners, they weren't getting along. The Brits sought to take
to colonize,
To colonize.
as they had.
everywhere else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, so is there war going on? Are the Brits using, some of the tribes as proxies, or are the Brits just sort of coming in and saying, "Hey, nice harbor you got there. Be a shame if, something were to happen to it, or what?"
Well, again, I'm not the best of historians, but you wind up with two major Boer wars that
Let's unpack
happened.
that word, because that.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
Boer just means farmer in
Okay.
Afrikaans, but the Afrikaan people call themselves the Boers. They're
Okay.
farmers, very much. And so what happens is that, as I said, you've got the British now coming in the late 1800s and let me look exactly here for you. Anyways, the late 1800s, and wanting to settle that. And the Boer are both trying to move out and not cause a big battle with the British, but at the same time, they are forced to confront them. And so you wind up having two major wars, which, interestingly, the Boers won both of, if you want to look at it that way. The first Boer War was fought between 1880 and 1881. They had moved north. The Boers they declared the independence of the Transvaal. And then you had the Battle of Bronkhorstspruit, in which they defeated and ambushed a British column with heavy losses. You had the Battle of Langsneck in 81 in January, in which the British were defeated trying to break through Boer positions. Then in February of 81, you had the Battle of Ingogo or Schoenshukti. The British suffered another defeat. And then in February 27, 1881, you had the Battle of Majuba Hill, which was another decisive Boer victory. British Commander Sir George Colley was killed. So finally, the British signed a peace treaty with the Boers in March the 23rd, 1881, in which they said the Transvaal could have its own self-government as long as they agreed to be under the British rule. And that was the end of the First Boer War. So they said, okay, we will be part of your colonization effort as long as we're allowed to self-govern ourselves in the Transvaal. Well, that didn't last too long, because that was 1881, but the Second Boer War breaks out in 1899, and it's fascinating because Churchill was involved in it, a lot of other historical figures, as was the founder of the Boy Scouts, which Lord Robert Baden-Powell, who wound up in the Siege of Mafeking, where the British were besieged by the South Africans. His experiences there of organizing these children who were stuck behind siege lines and finding something useful for them to do led to him eventually later going back to Britain and founding the Boy Scouts. So it's kind of an interesting little tidbit of history there too. So in October the 11th, 1899, war begins again with the Boers in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. They declare war on Britain. What's happened in the meantime, of course, is gold and diamonds have been discovered, and the British are coming in much bigger, and they're like, yeah, I think we want the gold and the diamonds, and they're saying, we're farmers, we don't want that. So war was declared. Well, in October through December that same year, the British suffered heavy defeats at Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso. So then we moved to February the 14th through the 27th, 1900, and the British were besieged in Kimberley and Ladysmith, but they were able to lift those sieges. In May the 31st, the British captured Johannesburg. In June of 1900, they occupied Pretoria, which is one of the capitals. And at that point, the Boers said, okay, we can't beat them in a stand-up war. It became like the American Revolution, more guerrilla warfare. They were mounted cavalry, and so it was a hit and run, and they were still winning. But here you come, another wonderful historical tidbit, the first use of concentration camps.
Oh, wow.
The British went in, they'd captured Pretoria, captured Johannesburg. They locked up all of the Afrikaner women and children
Oh,
in
wow.
concentration camps and were busy having high death rates in those camps, whether or not they were deliberately starving them or whatever, but they
Yeah.
were not surviving in the death camps and in the concentration camps. And so they came in off of their guerrilla warfare, signed in May of 1902. The Treaty of Vereeniging, and that meant that they accepted British sovereignty, and that was the end of the Boer War and the end of Afrikaner rule, as it were, in a lot of ways, until more into the modern era when South Africa then was no longer a British colony.
Okay. Well, so let's jump to the kind of the modern era.
Okay.
When you lived there, was Nelson Mandela kind of big news all the time? Because in my childhood, which was, I was born in 79, right? So the 80s, I felt like I heard about Nelson Mandela a lot, you know?
Yes.
And so before we get to that, though, so just kind of set the stage then for, so when you get there, who's kind of in charge, and how many tribes are there, and what is their relationship to each other, you know? Like if we just parachuted into when you kind of show up, you know?
Okay. All right. So I arrived there in 1981. De Klerk was in charge of the Afrikaan government after the British had turned over the colony in 1961. South Africa became a republic. And
now, was this when Britain, you know, this is post World War II, sort of the empire's exhausted.
Yeah.
Elizabeth is sort of turning an empire into a commonwealth. That's my understanding of what kind of took place at that time. So the empire's kind of divesting itself and giving their subjects the opportunity to self-rule. So they did that, and South Africa said, okay.
Okay.
Is that what happened?
Yes, that's pretty much what happened. I think that's pretty good understanding of it. And so South Africa is a republic, but it is a separated apartheid republic, which means that blacks do not have the vote initially.
When you showed up, you're saying?
Okay, now by the time, we're going back before I showed up, was in 61. Then the big Soweto uprising was in 76.
Okay.
I didn't arrive until 81, but Nelson Mandela had been released from prison. No, was released from prison during the time we were there in 1990.
Okay.
So between the Soweto uprising and when we got there in 81, a lot of things were happening. The government was busy trying to do a lot of reforms. And so they were opening up voter registration rolls for everyone for everything except the national elections. So you could vote in your local city, county, school, whatever elections were up. But you still had very separated, and I think there's kind of often a misunderstanding of apartheid by saying it's just a black-white issue. It is, but it's much more complicated than that too, because as you were just saying, tribal. So it's very hard for us to understand tribalism. We have to kind of go back to Europe and the time of the Huns and the Franks and the various people overrunning each other, and how the Brits were fighting the Wends or behind Hadrian's Wall or whatever, to understand the kind of tribalism that, is in South Africa, because you have language differences, you have cultural, genetic differences, and they're very distinct and very strong. And a large part, now again, this is my humble opinion, but a large part of what I could understand was that in order to stop the tribes from having such slaughter of each other, the British segregated them off just like we did the American Indians in a way, except we wound up taking a lot of the different American Indian tribes and forcing them to live together on reservations in Oklahoma or whatever when they weren't natural friends. So it had to have been a very difficult thing. Well, they had a lot of land, and so a lot of the different tribes were in different big land areas the Zulus down in Natal, the Ndebele up in the northern part of the country, the Setswana, and other places. And the British had essentially kind of arranged it to where the Afrikaners and the English were sort of like no-go war peace zones between these different tribes. And they said that stopped some of the major tribal clashes that were happening under the British.
Okay.
But of course, it's becoming industrialized now. It's becoming citified. People from all of these different tribes and areas are going to Johannesburg and Pretoria and other places for work. And so maybe if I can share with you a couple of things that to me help kind of define things. So here I am, like I said, with a very small baby and other things. And it was interesting to me when we got there, the largely Afrikaner people that were in charge of the university and gave us our jobs, they said, look, you're being paid very well, but we are socialistic minded. We want employment for people. We expect you to take part of that salary and hire a maid and a gardener and spread the wealth. Hire people when you can hire them. We want people to be fully employed. We want to develop this country. We're trying to get the vote. We're trying to have free education for everybody. Free medical care for essentially free medical care for everybody. So like if no matter what you came in to the medical hospital that I was working at, you paid $5 and all of your cancer treatments, whatever. So when I wound up pregnant with my second child, with my third child when I was there, I had a second child who had Down syndrome, and I was like, well, I do want to see how are things going. So I decided to do an amniocentesis, and where I went to do it was at the, quotes, Black Medical University because the medicine was more advanced there than elsewhere in town. But I'm kind of getting in front of myself about the tribalism. So I had hired a maid, and as American, I was like, no, I don't want a maid. I've never had a maid, but okay, if I'm supposed to, I will. And so one day there's this woman screaming and shouting, and I look out my window in our courtyard outside the kitchen. There's my maid and this other Black woman. And the only way I can describe it is like two fighting dogs. They were circling each other and threatening each other and screaming at each other. And I'm terrified. I go lock myself in the bedroom with my baby. And do I call the police? What do I do? After a while, it kind of quiets down. And I go out, and the other lady is gone, and I talked to my maid, and I said, what happened? Was that woman trying to rob us, or was she threatening you? What was going on? And she said, oh, no, she was looking for work, and she's from a different tribe than mine, and I sent her on her way. And I'm like, okay. And a couple of weeks later, I go into my kitchen, and she's sitting with another African lady, and they're having a nice cup of tea. And a little bit later, I'm conversing with her, and I said, oh, was that one of your relatives or friends? How nice. They came, and y'all had a cup of tea together, whatever. She said, oh, no, she was looking for work, and she's from my tribe. And I told her, this lady up there needs a maid, and that lady down there needs a maid. Okay. And so that was kind of my first real eye-opener to that, the tribal issues. And the
we reduce everything to black and white, in part because in the American experience that was those were the two tribes, if you will. Legally and culturally it was white and black. Discrimination was done on the basis of color alone. But what you're saying is that in Africa, especially South Africa, the tribes themselves really didn't get along.
Yeah, the tribes themselves amazingly would, given the opportunity, if you were vulnerable, you would literally be killed. Yeah. And so you would have like 3 Zulu killed in a week, and then they would say, well, that's enough, and they would get an armed party of Zulu, and they would go and kill 3 Matabele or something. And maybe the Hatfields of McCoys might give us some idea
or
of
the Bloods and the Crips.
Yeah, whatever, or maybe gang, so it was kind of hard for us to comprehend. But another story like that was that one of my maids, the project my husband was working on was down in the Cape Flats, and they were building low-cost housing for the African people that they could afford and that would use a minimal of energy. And so it's a great project putting up hundreds of homes, literally. So my maid, I said, well, you want to come with us to Cape Town? We're going to be down at Cape Town for about a week. She said, well, I've never been there. Okay, yeah, I'll come with you. So we drove 2 days to get to Cape Town, overnight, and then on down. She started getting kind of nervous the first day, and the second day, we pull into, and it's a big walled compound where these research buildings are, and it's guarded and has a guard dog and a sentry. And we go in, and I said, look, why don't you stay in that house? We're staying in this house we had, set up. She said, can I borrow your radio? I had a little portable radio. And I said, sure, Well, she comes back about 15 minutes later, and she said, you have to put me on a train immediately. I have to be out of here immediately. And I was like, what's wrong? She couldn't get her language on the local radio. So she was, in her mind, in complete enemy territory and very vulnerable. So I had to tell her, I said, look, we're inside a wall compound. There is an armed guard. If you still feel that way in the morning, I'll make sure you get on a train straight back to Pretoria. But let's just settle down for the night. It's more dangerous to go out and try to find a train. Well, during the night, a night watchman came on. That was her tribe. Because, again, you couldn't hire...
How did they know?
Language, because they're speaking completely different languages. But you know how the Scottish plaids and tartans identify you? Well, they also wear beaded, I wish I'd had one to bring with me today, a little kind of a 3-inch square bead that would show your tribe is a very common thing for people to wear too, but it's language. And
it seems kind of dangerous to do that though, But I guess if you don't do it, then it's almost like you're hiding something or you're ashamed of your tribe or something. It could work both ways.
Yeah. They didn't. I don't know that they wore those all the time, but that was one of the things.
I got you.
But I think it's largely language that defined how you talk to each other, and you realize, oh, that's a Zulu, that's an Ndebele, that's a Matabele.
Well, like the Rwandan genocide, right, between the Hulu and the Tutsis.
Hutu. I want to say.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But anyway, I watched the movie Hotel Rwanda.
It was tribal, yeah.
And they got into this whole thing where it's like, well, the other tribe's nose is this wide, and and I that it sounds like Nazi stuff, right? Where it's like these people look this way, and there might be some truth to general facial structures and stuff, but I'm guessing among the 10 tribes, you couldn't, generally speaking, probably tell them apart that way. So I was just curious as to identifiers.
That may be our own kind of, I don't know. The Zulus are, I think, taller and, more statuesque than some of the others. But really, to me, the distinguishing features are not that great, but they could well be to those tribes. They might look at somebody a bit more. Yeah. And, of course, in certain tribes, you have dress, obviously, too, other dress, like the Ndebele women that, I hope I have that right, that wear those golden neck things that actually wind up stretching their necks because they're put on from childhood. Gives them where they can't actually hold their head up without that jewelry and things. So there are other tattoos and marks and other things, plus clothing that define them a bit.
Okay, so given the possibility of violence, given the sounds like rather extreme fear that certain people lived under, if they were in the wrong place at the wrong time or something to that effect, what is apartheid in that context? Generally speaking, what I was always told growing up, apartheid bad. Apartheid is white people separating themselves from black people, and just it's basically just like the American South, where you have discrimination or segregation
Mm-hmm.
based on race. Is
Yeah.
that what apartheid is?
Well, like I said, as with most problems in our world, I
Yeah.
think it is much more complicated than that. It did start under the British as giving some peace to the tribes and separating them a bit from each other so they weren't so warring, and giving them their own more or less essential homelands, places where they
Okay.
could farm and live in peace. Uh, as it evolved later, it became understood much more of a separation of black and white, and did mimic the American South in
Okay.
terms of buses and, this is whites only, this is blacks only, places and things. So, yeah, it's, and they, as I said, you did have some very forward thinking people that maybe don't get as much credit as they should, like de Klerk and some of the other major leaders who released Nelson Mandela, who were trying for a peaceful transition.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask about Mandela, because was he a communist? Is that I'm not necessarily to paint him in a bad light, although I'm not pro communism, but was he? I don't know. Sometimes when we're told one version of history, but then later we find out it actually wasn't quite like that. And so I guess my question is, he's always kind of portrayed as this peace-seeking, guy who was kind of a martyr for the cause of peace.
Yeah, I think he was not the, well, I mean, you have to say he was a radical freedom fighter. He was by the definition of that time, a terrorist. He was involved in planning several major bombings that happened.
Okay.
That's why he's in prison.
Okay.
But he did not personally set the bombs and did not personally kill anybody, as I understand. And that is why he was given a lifetime sentence rather than a death sentence. The Afrikaners were still very proud of having an independent and Western-style judiciary. So then he becomes more of a figurehead for revolution and independence. Now, the ANC, the African National Congress, are strong communists, and
they're still around today.
And they're still running the country today.
Okay.
There's several other, parties, but they very much took a communist line of revolution and crushing of religion. So it was kind of ironic to me that, here, so I'm Lutheran and part of a missionary Nordic Lutheran church in Johannesburg, and we have a sister church in Soweto. And in the middle of all this turmoil that was going on in the late 80s into the 90s, the Nordic Lutheran Church yanks our priest and says we're withdrawing him, although he was an older man at that time and had grown up as a son of African missionaries, lifelong African missionaries. So we're losing our pastor, and we don't know how we're going to replace him and how we're going to keep, functioning with our sister church in Soweto and everything. In the meantime, my maid at that time, who is a devout African Christian, goes to worship in her hometown, and her daughter gets attacked, and she gets attacked by communists with the ANC, who wound up axing her daughter in the head. She lived over it, but it was such a horror, and telling them, that's just white man's poison. You shouldn't be Christian. You shouldn't have any religion. We're going to eliminate that when we take over as communists. So
the kill the Boer, which has kind of resurfaced recently, these chants of kill the Boer, which, as we said, is the African word for farmer, and they kind of write it off, well, it's just kind of an old song. It doesn't mean much. But communism would necessarily, everywhere you see it, it's the elimination of private property. I mean, by definition. So I'm guessing that the Afrikaners developed excellent farming techniques for literally centuries, and
Yes.
probably owned most of the arable, farmland
A good bit of it, although not within those tribal apartheid areas. So there was large areas
large
that
tracts.
are
So there are black farmers that, as I understand it, also get
Yes.
attacked.
Yes, they do.
Perhaps
yeah.
in the name of communism, under the same principles
Yeah.
of, this is corporate farmland,
Or in the
etc.
name of tribalism.
Yeah. I think in Zimbabwe, my understanding, a very corrupt
Yes.
country, they did the same thing to the farmers. I'm guessing for the same reasons, but then they gave it back because they starved or something. I don't know
Well,
if
no,
that's true.
they haven't given it back,
Oh,
and they're
okay.
still starving. It was really bad. In what was previously Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, when that revolution
And you can't
took
call it
them-
Rhodesia because Rhodes he was English, and he was a
English, right,
colonizer,
yeah.
and so we had to change the name. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, but that's interesting too. But we won't go too deep into any of that. But the British, as often, they supported one tribe over another in order to get control of that area of Rhodesia, and made the guys who were the upper dogs, the underdogs at that. But anyway, yes, when Zimbabwe became independent, they just simply confiscated all of the farmland. And that was an absolute breadbasket for the whole of Africa. And now they can't even feed themselves. You can't just turn over and go back to more primitive farming techniques and hope to get the same kind of production. It sounds like a good idea, but it just doesn't work.
And Zimbabwe, if I remember correctly, had and has maybe still like a $1 billion bill. Right, I think their inflation was so crazy that they had to literally create, like we have a $1 bill. Well, they had like a $1 billion bill.
And I think at that point they pretty much gave up because they simply couldn't print it fast enough, and it was wheelbarrows worth of cash would give you one loaf of bread, if that. Almost all of that area, plus a good bit of the world, really just has a dollar economy. Dollars are very valuable, even though they're being, traded hand to hand and being worn out. But, that is the only thing that kind of holds a little bit of stable value.
But South Africa's, it's so interesting right now, still, to this very day, because if you look at, well, first of all, like the G7, right, South Africa, I believe, was one of the 7, or at least it's in the G20, right? So
I think it's in the G20 at least.
Okay,
right.
So it's one of the biggest. If you look at the BRICS, which is the attempt of a coalition to form a new currency between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they're the S of BRICS, and so it still wants to be a major player, but it seems like they have to sort of decide, like, are we going to be a Western country, which is obviously our history, given our settlement, our colonization, or, are we going to leave kind of this global marketplace, but, and obviously Trump has, really come down on, not to make this political, but, he is saying that if you leave the American dollar, that you'll face great tariffs and such. So South Africa seems like it's really at a crossroads, and it seems like a terrible time, to revisit racial grievances. But that seems like what's happening with the Kill the Boer chants, and so on and so forth. So, and it seems like what'll happen is we'll say kill the Boer, and then light is brought to that, as it was when Trump, quite dramatically a few months ago, with the South African prime minister or president, played chants of that in the Oval Office when he was there for a visit, shocking the entire South African delegation, saying, "What's up with this? You don't approve of this, do you? And it was kind of played off like, well, we don't really mean that. That's just like locker room talk or something.
Yeah. Well, words have power, and words have meaning, and I think all of us should, as Scripture tells us, guard our tongues. That's for sure, because a lot of evil can come from there. So,
is it really happening? Are farmers really dying?
Well, I know very few people, relatively, because it's a long time since I lived there, or whatever. But one of our friends was murdered on his farm, and so it makes me feel like if I personally know somebody who has been murdered on their farm, it's a serious problem.
Yeah.
And anybody will tell you it is a serious problem. And then I have another really good friend who's a veterinarian and retired. And in the last year, she's had to move off of her farm because they poisoned her guard dogs. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down. The lawlessness situation, in addition to murder, is just very serious right now. Carjackings, theft, other things. When they finally kept stealing her water pump that was watering her animals, she finally said that's it. And she and a couple of other people that I know, they've had to move into gated, guarded communities because they're just not safe.
Yeah.
And it's a sad situation. I'm sure that unfortunately the Black people are suffering horribly also with the lawlessness in the country, and the breakdown of law and order, and government corruption, and you name it. They can't keep the electrical grid going because they literally steal the power lines. There's
It's the
just
ABCs
so
of
much
civilization, infrastructure, access to water, access to power.
power you have to have.
And it takes a lot of force at the end of the day to keep that going because,
And it's so tragic because, it's so easy to destroy things and so hard to build them up, And you had there in South Africa literally world-class medicine, world-class electronics, grid system, you name it. There, the first heart transplant was done there in Cape Town, and so much of the good university systems, and it's all just falling apart. And, there's a real example of racism that, you cannot, if you're white, go to university. You are banned from university.
They call it reverse racism.
Yeah, all the places are reserved for Blacks only at this point.
So, in general, how did you feel like the Dutch treated the people of color, the Black people? However, I don't mean to sound politically incorrect, but how did you feel like when you got to know them? Did you feel like secretly they were racist, or was it like, well, we came and we developed this nation, and then they came and they don't always get along, and we don't always get along with them, but what was your sentiment? Because if they were Calvinist, right? If they were Dutch Reformed, most of them were Christian, I'm assuming. So
my impression of the Afrikaners were that they were strong Christians, and that gave them a strong feeling of wanting religious freedom for all, if possible, and wanting the best for everyone. As I said, now could be just the group I worked with, but the doctors that I worked with at Medusa were some of the strongest Christians I've ever known in my life, and they were working there serving the African people out of a sense of service and Christian duty. And their hearts were breaking when the communists set up boycotts around our hospital. And I remember one of the poor doctors who was there sitting on the floor, and she was just in absolute tears because she knew if her dialysis patients couldn't get into the hospital, they were dead. And she had been keeping them alive for years and loved them and wanted them to be alive until she could get a transplant, a kidney transplant for them. And one of the African nurses, hats off to her. I mean, that was a pretty violent picket line we had outside. She went out and really argued with them and said, you've got to let these people into the hospital. This is not liberty. This is not freedom. This is you're causing people to die, literally. And the response from this communist person was they're better off dead
Wow.
than living under apartheid. So it was a very difficult time. And as I said to Clerk, bless his heart, he used to run the whole social system.
Yeah. So
And
he was the
then,
president of South Africa?
he was the
Okay.
president at the time, and he's the one that really worked with Mandela to get the Constitution going, to get
Okay.
to hand over power.
Okay.
And he had gone from being the head of the social system in South Africa to during the really tough fighting times, being the person who was trying to access munitions to keep the battle going while the battle was still going. But he also was the real mover and shaker who then said, no, we want a peaceful transition. We want to move on. And I think it was broad Christian principles. The Dutch had come there, the Afrikaners had come centuries earlier, fleeing religious persecution. Their understandings of how important it is to be free is just so ingrained in their genetics that they don't want anybody living under oppression, communist or racist or other things. And they were moving and as fast as they felt they could without having everything fall apart. But you know how we often say reform breeds revolution, and I think that's the case. And it's happened in many other places too. Once you get reforms going, it sometimes just simply makes people even more impatient. Let's just get it done.
Yeah.
And I think they just pushed on through. Let's just get it done rather than on the 15-year timeline we have. Let's push it on to 2 or 3.
Right. I'm reading a book. It's a very long biography of Lee Harvey Oswald. But at one point when he's in the military, he's a Marine, and another Marine asks him, if they are religious or believe in God, and he says, well, I'm a communist. That's my favorite religion. And he was kind of a provocative guy. He might have he said things to kind of see how people would react. He was somewhat egotistical in that way. But the point, what I'm thinking of here is that communism does in many ways act as a religion. So my question is, in terms of being kind of a universal, all-encompassing system, my question is, did the tribal Africans convert to Christianity? Did the Afrikaners have any impact in evangelizing, those from the tribe? And what would have been the consequence if someone maybe left a tribe for Christianity? And another question, did communism subvert tribal identity over time?
Well, I don't think communism's been there long enough to subvert tribal identity yet.
So it's still there.
I think they would aim at that probably if they had the chance.
Yeah.
I did bring my little cheat sheet here on religions and everything. So there have been very active missionary and active Afrikaner missionaries, plus the Lutherans. As I said, we were part of the Lutheran group there, and Baptists, and you name it. There, so it's a difficult question, like all the ones you're asking me here. So I don't know.
Well, it's okay. In your anecdotal experience,
right?
You like, for example, you mentioned that your maid was a Christian,
right?
So was she converted? Was she brought to Christianity by the Afrikaner people, generally speaking?
I think she probably was brought by a Pentecostal or a Baptist missionary, but there were also Reformed Church missionaries and Dutch missionaries. So yes, and I think the fact of them being there for 2 centuries brought in a lot of Christianity. Yeah. Old ways die hard, though, as one famous author said, and I can't remember which book and things. So there is still a lot of worship of animals, animism, and other things, even though 80% of the people in the country say they're Christian.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it's a very largely nominally Christian country. And then you've got very small amounts of Muslims, Buddhists, Hindu,
Hmm.
others. But it is a largely Christian
Okay.
country, even though under that Christian veneer, there will be a lot of tribal beliefs still, which
Okay.
function.
Yeah.
And that may be a topic for another day.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I saw a lot of that at the mental hospital where I was working, because we had to sit, the whole board had to sit on a committee if someone might possibly get the death penalty, to determine, were they sane, were they aware of what they did when they committed this act, not were they guilty or not. That wasn't our business to deal with. But we had phenomenal translators there at the mental hospital, and so much of what came up was this an issue of witchcraft, and was the person, is that his belief, and it was sane, and so he felt like this was a witch that had to be killed? Or was this an issue of how we deal with the elderly?
Yeah.
And
In
so,
other words, they were old and it was time for them to be put out to pasture, so I killed them. So you're saying something like that? Like that's how we deal with the elderly in our tribe. So then it's like, well, do you deserve the death penalty for doing what your tribe says?
well, and it was interesting, and so to just give one instance of
Yeah.
that, was that they denied the killing. The snake water god came and took the person out of their bed, leaving a trail of water back to the river, but it was obviously a murder.
Oh man. Okay.
So, like I said, it's a very complicated
Yeah.
thing, and so they're like, no, the snake god came and took them. That happens to the
Yeah.
elderly a lot in our tribe. So anyway,
man.
that's where I got acquainted with a lot of the different beliefs. So a lot of people might have nominally said, yeah, we're Christian, but they still have a lot of other
Right.
beliefs, and witchcraft especially. And you had a lot of practicing witch doctors or medicine men, and you would not want to be an albino because their body parts were thought to be very healing, and
boy.
unfortunately they would be killed and cut up for things. So there's a lot of difficulties going on there. Plus, so often we were trying to get people on Western medicines. They got right out. They would go see the local healer, who would say, throw away all those Western medicines and I've got this for you or that. As a matter of fact, interestingly, so I was part of the renal dialysis unit at the hospital there. Most of the white women who were coming to the renal dialysis unit had destroyed their kidneys by taking over-the-counter painkillers. Beware of naproxen and ibuprofen and all that if you take too much of it.
Yeah.
Most of the African women who came to the hospital with destroyed kidneys had been given poisons by the medicine men that were supposedly curative, but were so toxic that it had destroyed their kidneys. So, so that was just another interesting. As I said, it's very complicated.
Well,
picture.
you started by end with this. You started by saying the customs agent said, "Well, you'll never understand it. Your daughter might." Maybe he was right.
I think he probably was right.
What do you think is the future?
It is, I remain in a way a bit of a Pollyanna. I think that most people, especially most good Christian people, want to treat each other well and live well together, and are peacemakers of one sort or another. Sadly, you sometimes have to have some strong good guys who beat down the 10% of the bad guys who somehow manage to destroy things. But, I still have an optimistic view of the world, and maybe a good kind of story to close with in terms of that is my daughter again, when he said, you won't understand this country, but she will. So when she was about 5 years old, I took her to Switzerland. I had to fly to Sweden to get warm enough winter clothes for her to survive in the winter in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And, we're in the hotel room and she looks out at snow for the first time and says, do we take off all our clothes and jump in it? And I was like, no, this is not the pool or whatever. So in any case, we were there in Switzerland for about 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And we're then in the Bern airport getting ready to fly back to South Africa. And Ursula, who's 5 years old, looks across the airport and she sees a black man. And she starts off running. And she throws herself on this man, hugging him. And I know when she started running and when I saw what was going on, it immediately clicked. And this poor man is like, why is this white child hugging me? What is going on? You know, and everything. I said, you know, she hasn't seen a black person in 2 weeks. You're home to her because this is who she's growing up amidst, largely black people.
Right.
And it was like, oh, a welcome face, somebody I can recognize. And so, you know, there in another way, I thought, yeah, you know, maybe he was right. Her worldview will always be a bit different than mine, but she will also have that, I think, acceptance and home feeling around a lot of African people that maybe I'll never completely have, not having grown up there, till a certain age. So, yeah, I would like to just, you know, say blessings on all those who are struggling in South Africa. It is a life-endangering situation for a lot of both our white and black brothers and sisters, as a lot of the law and order is really struggling. Are they going to stay with BRICS and try to become a communist total solution that has failed everywhere else and will fail again? Or will maybe better sense prevail and they try to get back together in a positive way?
Well, I'm Pollyanna-ish in the sense that I think Christianity offers, you know, the solution.
The only solution, absolutely.
You know, it's far above tribalism and racialism, and it offers us peace and all of that. So my hope is that Christianity can spread in a very real way in that part of the world and all these parts of the world, and that we can live more at peace. But anyway, well, people can find you again at United Lutheran Church in Swiss Alps. Out near Schulenburg.
Out near Schulenburg.
And so
we're 158 years young.
All right.
It's listed on the Historical Churches Tour out in Fayette County, and on the Painted Churches Tour, although we're kind of the opposite. We're a pietist form church. But yes.
Well, I'll forgive your youth since we're 174 years old as a church. But, you know, not bad. Not bad. For Texas, you're quite old. People don't know. But yes. Well, thank you for stopping in, LeMae. And until next time, friends, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.
Yes.